I used to work with an officer who loved to make everything overly dramatic. He had a very bad habit of throwing out things over the radio and then not responding to dispatch when they tried to get more information. "Dispatch, I've got one running." And then silence. "Dispatch, I'm in pursuit, 5th and Lincoln." More silence. "Dispatch, send me more units." Then nothing. It got old fast. While many of the patrol officers thought the guy was annoying, we never really thought about how that must affect dispatch. Sitting at the console listening to everything over a radio doesn't give you much opportunity to change things. It doesn't let you be in control. And most of us in public safety have to be in control. One night, after the annoying officer had been especially dramatic, I saw our dispatcher stop him in the hallway. You know there's a button on the side of that radio they give you. Try pressing it and talking every once in a while. I could see all that pent-up frustration bubbling to the surface. The officer walked past the dispatcher, ignoring him, and looked at me. "What's his problem?" he asked me. "You are," I responded. "If you don't get your head out of your ass, they aren't going to be there when you need them, so knock it off." That guy never got it, but I did. Dispatch was our lifeline. And not just our lifeline, everyone's. It's time to start telling our own stories. I'm Steve Kellums, and welcome to Blue Canary. Jeff Schemmer is a longtime friend and colleague of mine. He's also an expert on the 911 system. Jeff began working in the 911 community 35 years ago as a dispatcher with the Bloomington Indiana Police Department. After the 1998 consolidation of dispatch services with BPD and Monroe County Sheriff's Office, he continued to serve as a dispatcher, training coordinator, and communications manager until 2019, when he accepted the position of executive director with Hamilton County Public Safety Communications. In 2022, Jeff was selected to be the executive director of the Indiana Statewide 911 Board. I had the pleasure of talking with Jeff about 911 telecommunicators and the challenges dispatchers face every day. Jeff, thank you very much for coming on and being on the podcast with me. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. I was really excited as I was looking at putting together a variety of topics this year, and I really wanted to focus on dispatchers. And yours was a name that really jumped up to the top of my list. One of the big reasons is because you were pretty much right there when I walked in the doors at Bloomington Police Department.
Well, I want to thank you for inviting me to be on. Yes, we did. You came in as one of our officers. You came in when I was still a dispatcher on the floor.
Tell me a little bit about that. You've been involved in dispatching for a very long time. Tell me about when you got into it, how you got into it, what drew you to it.
Well, I am now going on my 35th year being involved in public safety communications. And I actually got into it because a neighbor of mine at the time was the supervisor for the Bloomington Police Department's dispatch center. And I was kind of in between jobs. And as it was back then and as it is now, they needed dispatchers because the turnover rate was there. So I thought, there'll be, a good fill-in spot. So I went to work there. And if you had asked me then where I would be in 35 years, I would have never guessed it was still in public safety communications. But I feel I'm very fortunate in it because, it's really made me helped me get where I am today.
Dispatchers and communication specialists, they do have a high turnover rate. Why is that?
I always say there's no silver bullet for it. We look at a lot of different things. Part of it's the pay is low, or historically was low. A lot of it is also it's not the 9-to-5 job, and you're aware as an officer there's going to be times when you're working weekends, you're going to be working nights. You're going to be working holidays, especially when you're the low man on the totem pole in an agency. So there's a variety of reasons that even from our standpoint, when we're recruiting now, we're trying to retain people. That's all stuff that we have to keep in mind when we're doing that.
Mandatory overtime seem to be the bane of dispatch centers. Is that tied to that retention problems that you tend to have?
Oh, it is. It is. I'm fortunate up here in the way that we do the hiring. We're able to bring people in and have them ready to go when somebody decides to leave. And right now, the people that are leaving are more the people retiring or some of the younger people that are becoming officers versus the burnout side, because we're spending a lot of time on the mental health aspect of it as well. So, but the hours are incredible. The last 2 years or the first 2 years, we haven't had to go back to our county council and asked for an additional appropriation in our overtime line.
That's amazing. You guys have put together such a solid and wonderful program up there. And you talk about how dispatchers moving on to getting into officers or getting involved in that police and patrol side, and even the fire side. I know there's a lot of that goes on there as well. Is that traditionally a stepping stone? I know that early on in my career, being involved at Indiana University, I did a lot of that dispatch work, so I did have some exposure to that. But do you see that as a common theme?
It comes and goes. For a long time, that was the stepping stone to get in for either being a firefighter or a police officer. And then for a while, we kind of got away from it. There was a period of time when we were in Bloomington, we would get students that were graduating from IU that had, criminal justice degrees, and they were looking for a job, but they weren't quite sure what they were going to do with it. So some of them would come to us and say, we want to be a dispatcher, because the pay at that time for us and around the state was pretty decent. And we would get about 6 or 7 years out of them, which we were always concerned that as soon as they come in, they would start looking to become an officer or jump off somewhere else. And we would spend a lot of time training them and then lose them. But on average, we probably got about 5 to 7 years out of some of them. I know prior to leaving there, that was something we didn't see anymore. We weren't getting college students coming in, and the people that were coming in were more in the 30s and up, rather than the people coming fresh out of college.
Do you think that was tied to compensation packages?
I think part of it is, yeah.
So let's back up a little bit. We definitely went down a direction, but I find all that very interesting. Let's back up a little bit and talk about big brushstrokes. What does a dispatcher do?
And it is a very big brush. Basically, what it comes down to is they're the first point in the process for somebody that's going to be requesting any type of public safety assistance. So it can come in from the standpoint of answering the 911 call, dispatching the appropriate police, fire, or EMS unit, keeping track of all that's going on, while they're also going to be fielding calls on the administrative calls for people calling in just for dog nuisances, loud noise complaints, and such. A lot of it has changed since I started, and obviously, even when you came on board, we were doing a lot of things manually, handwriting notes and stuff, and now we've got a lot of electronics to help us. And that job just continues to kind of expand with all the technology we have to use now.
So does everyone in the U.S. have the 911 system?
They do at different levels. There was a point where some places didn't. I'd say the biggest thing that hurts on the 911 system now is from the cellular side, since everybody's going to cellular calls, are the areas that do not have cellular connectivity. So those would be the areas where in the past you would have what we call the landline to be able to call 911. Now it's based on your reception on your cell phone, and there are a lot of areas that don't necessarily have that connectivity to be able to make those phone calls.
That's very interesting to me because, again, back in the day, you picked up the phone and you dialed 9 and you had to wait until it came back around to the 1. And they always knew where you were at because, they would know where that phone number was coming from. How do you guys know where the cell phone user's at? How do you know whenever they dial 911 on that cell phone? One, how does it know which dispatch center to go to? And then how do you know where to send people?
That's the technology. I'll kind of backtrack. The cellular phone has had the biggest impact on my eyes in public safety communications over anything that I've seen over the years. And that's because it's made the job more challenging, but it's also allowed, it's more rewarding from the standpoint of being able to get people help when they need it. So when it originally came in, and I won't dive into the real technical part of it, but basically when you dial on a cell phone and it comes to us, if it comes in on what we call a phase 2, which means we have all the information, all we get is your callback number and the lat long or the address for the tower that it's hitting off of. Back in the landline days, we had your name, we had your address and stuff. So with the cell phones, that's what we start off with. And
that's not a lot of information to start working from when somebody's screaming for help.
Oh no, it's not. So, and when you start looking at a map and trying to figure out the area that you might have to go to, it could be different. Back in the old days, if you hit to get a fairly accurate location, you have to hit off what we call 3 towers. because it uses the old way of triangulations to determine that. If you're hitting off two towers, you don't have that, and you will literally see the location when we're trying to map that phone call moving back and forth along a straight line, and it gives us that idea. The technology has changed since then. There are companies that have come out that have helped us immensely in being able to capture that information and do the calculations to where now we can probably be realistically within a quarter of a block of an individual, depending on whether they're in a building or not. And I remember when we used to test it, and we were lucky if we were within 4 blocks of one.
Still, that's a lot better than having a direction on a map and saying, hopefully it's somewhere within miles of that.
Oh, yes, it is. And actually, it's accurate enough, and the timing of it, and as far as the information we're able to receive, is to the point to where if we've got somebody on a 911 call, we can pretty much track them as they move.
This fascinates me, and I have a ton of questions about specifics that I'm going to try to wait and get into those. So I want to move a little bit and talk about, obviously, the importance to public safety with that 911 dispatcher being the first person in the emergency system that people deal with. You guys have to deal with a lot of emotion. How do you do that?
It's difficult. I think as time goes on, we are starting to see the effects of it more than when I originally started. I'd say probably within about the last 3.5 years, we have started. When I say we, I'm talking about the industry in general, have started to take a really hard look at the mental aspect. Because for us, when we take that phone call for whatever is, as traumatic as it may be, we dispatch, who needs to go to it, whether it's police, fire, or EMS. They go, they respond, and then we immediately turn around and we're continuing to answer phone calls. And, potentially you could have back-to-back bad calls, and we won't necessarily have that ability just to get up from the console and take a break before you come back. We're starting to see more instances of when people are leaving. I think what we used to call burnout is probably more along the standpoint for mental health reasons. They're just, they just can't do it anymore.
I think public safety in general kind of draws those type A personalities, or those personalities that tend to like to be in control. One of the things that's always fascinated me about the communication side is that to be able to answer that phone, deal with that problem, or listening to the radio when other officers or fire or EMS are out there screaming for help or doing that, and it's all out of your control. Is that a big challenge that they're facing on the mental health side?
It's huge. As you said, we're all type A, and dispatchers are control freaks. Whenever you try to automate something for a dispatcher, they feel like it's taking away control. And, personally from my side, I think I was into this field for about 2, maybe 3 years. And I kind of felt that way on the 911 side. And I ended up going to work part-time, for the ambulance service. I became an EMT because to me, that was my outlet to actually feel like I had some control over it. Now, with it on the whether it's on the phone or on the radio, that's a lot of it. I'd say the majority of the stuff that we deal with now, from mental health counseling and stuff, it's more along the lines of not having the ability to do something or feeling helpless. So, if it's an officer involved shooting, an officer involved in an accident, the dispatchers take that really personal.
Do you have a specific incident, or is there any one thing that pops into your mind that you had to deal with?
Yeah, there is. During my time as a dispatcher, I've had to give CPR instructions to 4 personal friends of mine for family members. One of them was an officer wife that I worked with when I was a dispatcher. He called in and she had collapsed, and I was talking him through CPR. And then we had another instance where a really good friend of mine who was a police officer, his wife called in because she came home and found her mom unconscious. And she called 911. She knows I work there. And when you're sitting next to a group of dispatchers, all of a sudden a dispatcher answers 911, and they turn around and look at you and go, they ask for you by name. It's not necessarily something you want to hear. And then you
Right.
get on and find out what's going on. So it's happened numerous times. I would love to be able to say they all worked out for the best, but that's not necessarily the case.
Those are huge challenges then that the dispatchers have to face, every day. What are some of the misconceptions that people have about the public safety dispatchers, maybe even inside and outside public safety?
They either look at it and think we're always busy, and I can only speak for the size of our centers. Obviously, a place like Chicago or New York is going to be a little bit different, or that they don't do anything at all while they're on shift, or it's very slow. And I used to sum it up as there are periods of boredom with brief periods of sheer terror. So you can be sitting there listening to loud party complaints, and then all of a sudden you get a phone call for an armed robbery where the individual, had shot the clerk or something as they were leaving the scene. A lot of people think, we use the term we multitask, and a lot of people think, well, all you got to do is just go in and answer a phone, and that's not necessarily it. So that's, part of it is that they think it's easier than what it is, and you'll find people once they get in, they realize it's not. In a hiring process, we usually have people come in and sit for 4 hours during our busiest shift. And we've had people walk out after that 4 hours and say, yeah, this job isn't what I thought it was. And they pull out the process.
Why do cops and dispatchers argue all the time?
We're type A.
You guys are always telling me where to go.
Yeah, that's it. And that's one of the few times we can do it and not go to jail. But no, I mean, and a lot of it is as close as we work, we don't always know what's going on the other side of the mic. So while I may have a dispatcher that's handling a police call at a certain time, and an officer has radio traffic for something, depending on what's going on in dispatch or the size of the center, that same dispatcher that's on the radio to that officer, depending on the size of the town, may also be the same one that handles the 911 calls that are coming in, also dispatching the fire department, and also dispatching EMS. So it's that juggling part that while the officer knows that all goes on, they may not realize that it's going on at the moment that they're trying to hit them up on the radio. The flip side to that is the dispatcher, when you come across the radio rather curt, and then they decide that, they don't like me or whatever, they don't understand you may be with somebody that's resisting. They're not aware of the situation that you're immediately dealing with, that they dispatched you to, and how it may have changed from how it came in or whatever. So there's those periods where usually when that radio traffic happens and there's the argument, either side is wrapped up in doing something and they don't know it. They don't realize they're both doing something. And that's one of the things we try to train our dispatchers is, if an officer is, I don't want to use the term hateful, but curt on the radio, think about the call that he's on and think about what he may be dealing with at that point in time.
Back in the day when we first started, the dispatch centers were right in our departments. They were right in the center of our buildings. We interacted with dispatchers all the time. The officers and the dispatchers did. Oftentimes officers would relieve dispatchers so that they could take a break or things like that. And that was pretty common early on in our career. But times have changed over the last 30 plus years. They've moved to centralized dispatching. They've put them in their own buildings, sometimes miles and miles away from any of the other public safety buildings. And they're very separate now. Is that good or bad?
It's good in some areas, and I think it's bad in others. I could say, let's say where I'm at now, up here in Hamilton County, we dispatch for 8 police departments, as many, maybe 8 or 9 fire departments, and we are centralized. Now, we're housed inside the sheriff's department facility, but we dispatch for a lot of agencies that are spread across, I think we're 349 square miles for Hamilton County. One thing that we see here is, even though we're separated, we still see a lot of interactions between police, fire, and the people that are actually working in dispatch. Obviously, we have some dispatchers that are married to officers. We have some officers that used to be dispatchers, and they still continue to have that connection with the people that are working. We had one recently that just went to work for our sheriff's department here that was a part-time dispatcher for us. And she said if there was any way she could continue to work here and work the road, she would do it because that's how much she enjoyed it. So I think a lot of it has to do with taking the time to recognize each other. And we do here. When something happens to an officer, or whether it's good or bad, we reach out to them. I can tell you when we do telecommunicators week here, my people, it started out, they didn't have to, buy food for a week. And now we have so many people and or departments saying, hey, we want to feed you. We're into like a week and a half now where, all the shifts throughout the day are being fed by people.
It's really great to hear where you're at now, and what a great program, and what a great communication center you guys have put together up there. But when I travel across the United States and do a lot of training for public safety officers and dispatchers, one of the things that seems to come out of that is that the dispatch center itself tends to get really dysfunctional in there, and a lot of people have complaints about that. Why do you think that is?
I think part of it is people get used to, well, that's the way it's always been. A lot of it is management styles. There are dispatch centers that I can pretty much tell you that their directors may not work the console, and in larger centers that's kind of difficult. But there are centers where the person that's oversees the whole operation never sets foot into the dispatch center and never sits down and takes the time to know their people or even worry about their concerns. And they get hung up on that, well, that's the way we've always done it. I have spent a lot of time over the years acting as a sponge. I listen to what different agencies do because I spend a lot of time talking to them through the various organizations that I'm members of. And I look at, well, what works for them? Will it work for us? I'm always exploring that. But the biggest thing is I want to treat my employees the way I want to be treated. And I think a lot of people miss out on that from the management side, and they don't realize exactly the effect that can have on the people that are underneath you. I walk in here of a morning, and if I'm having a bad day in the office dealing with stuff, I walk out on the floor. And I've got 12 people at any given moment. When I walk out on that floor, they're more than willing to bust my chops about something. And I mean, hysterically, making fun of me or doing different things. And that pretty much is my fix. And I go back in my office and work. So we've got a real good conversation, or a real good group from stuff. I can go in there, sit down and have a conversation and talk to somebody about what their kid's doing in sports.
Then obviously that getting those type of people, it's going to be really critical in the hiring process and the onboarding process. You already talked about having applicants come in and sit during your busiest times. The question I have for you is, what do you look for when hiring a dispatcher?
It has changed. To say that we look for a particular talent or something, it's not there like it used to be. And I say that from when I go back to saying, well, this is how we've always done it. The thing used to be somebody goes, oh, I can tell you in 3 weeks whether or not they're going to make it through the training program. That's not the case anymore. And the example that I will use is personal with me at my previous center. And we had brought in a new group of hirees. And there was one that during the training session, whenever I would walk in there and just kind of watch, was very quiet. And she was in her early 20s, and she just didn't seem to engage in it. And I remember talking to our training coordinator at that time, on side conversations going, oh, I don't know if she's necessarily going to make it because just how quiet she was. But when she got on the floor, it was a different ball game. Classrooms bored her. She wants to learn hands-on. And once she went hands-on, she became one of the star dispatchers. Eventually, she moved her way up to supervisor, and now she's working for one of the CAD vendors traveling the United States as a trainer, teaching dispatchers how to use their computer-aided dispatch systems. When that happened, I started changing the way we started recruiting and when we started removing people from the process. So before we would look at it and go, oh, this person, there's nothing in their history that ties into what we're doing, and we would remove them. Now we look at that, and as long as the application is, complete and all that part of it, we at least test them to see what their test scores are. And then we keep that in mind as we move forward. And I think that's one of the reasons why up here, we're not below our staffing levels.
One of the things that always impressed me when you were running our center was the training that you went about providing to your new hires and setting up those dummy terminals and having them being able to input information and take kind of scenario-based calls. I always thought that was a really great idea. What type of training do dispatchers receive typically?
Unfortunately, in a lot of cases, not enough. I was fortunate enough to where I worked with several directors from Central Indiana to help draft the bill that surprisingly we got through on the first time just this year, and the governor signed it. And for the first time ever, Indiana finally has minimum training standards for a dispatcher.
What are those training standards?
Basically, we look at it from a 40-hour course, similar to like an officer when they first come on board before they go to ILEA.
Right.
But basically, we look at all of the requirements that's needed. So it's got to be including the phone. It's got to include radio training. We call it public safety or telecommunications classification 1, which covers the whole radio and phone part of it. They've got to be trained in fire operations. They have to be trained in EMS operations. And that's just the bare minimum for what we're asking them to do. We're fortunate enough here in Indiana, though. The argument used to be that, well, we can't afford that kind of training, let's say for the smaller agencies. We have picked the courses that are required for that, what we call those minimum training standards, and the statewide 911 board covers the cost on all those classes. So all it's going to cost you is sending somebody to the class. So that saves a lot of the money. And then, you build upon what we call those minimum training standards. For our center up here, prior to COVID shutting down everything, for my 75, I think I got 75 dispatchers, we were like 75 or 7,800 hours of training that year.
That's
last
fantastic.
year, because of COVID, we're down to about 5,400.
Back in the day when they hired you, did you get any training other than here's the phone and push that button to talk?
I have to say I was fortunate, and I've met dispatchers that have gone through that. I was fortunate in the fact that they had at least some kind of an organized training to where I literally had somebody shadowing me until they felt I was ready to be cut loose. It varied from person to person as far as, how fast they caught on, but at least it wasn't me walking in the door and they say, here's the 10 codes, here's the radio, and oh, that's the phone, and then call me if you have any problems. I sat next to experienced dispatchers for quite a while.
You're being pretty nice to Dean.
No, I wouldn't. No. Actually, Kim was the one that trained me. So, and Kim and I still stay. We still stay in contact. That's a relationship that, as much as we butted heads or whatever the case is, I credit her for making me what I am today, and I tell her that.
So training then, Indiana's taken some steps to get some nice basic training in there, but it really varies across the United States. What would you say the typical amount of training dispatchers are getting across the United States is?
That's hard to judge right now. There's a lot of states that do not have any minimum training standards. So to say what the average is, it's really hard to say. I can say where I came from, our classroom was generally 5 to 6 weeks just in the classroom. That was learning the basics, and then you would continue on the floor, and then you would get checked off each skill, whether it be call taking, radio, or whatever. Our classroom here is about a week longer. They go out on the floor, train for a bit, then we pull them back in and train them some more in the classroom. And then we have monthly training, or actually weekly training, that we push out to everybody that may not necessarily be classroom. But as far as, what the average is, it's hard to say. It's hard to say. I think when the state, ILEA did their radio program, I think it was just a flat 40 hours as well.
Would it be fair to say that across the United States, you'd like to see dispatchers getting more mandated and mandatory training?
Yes, there's not a doubt in my mind. And I think, again, that's one of the things that we kind of look at is a lot of us that are in it to see it become an actual profession. By federal labor laws, a 911 dispatcher or a public safety telecommunicator dispatcher is clerical, we're not even public safety or considered first responders.
That's crazy to me.
Yeah.
You don't see a whole lot of CPR over 911 working the photocopier.
Yeah. No.
And that's no insult to people working photocopiers. That's just simply, you guys are the front lines of public safety, and to say that you're not part of public safety is absolutely ridiculous.
It is, and some states have taken it upon themselves to go ahead and recognize them as first responders. Indiana did that last year for us. And I think we're on our third attempt trying to get it pushed through at the federal level. It's, hopefully one of these days it'll happen. It's just, I think that's part of it. We want to be considered professional, just like police officers, firefighters, and paramedics. And hopefully one day that will happen. But we also recognize that it's hard to sit there and say it's a profession when you don't have the training behind it to back it. So that was part of the reason why we went with come up with the minimum training standards here in Indiana. And that's why a lot of the agencies that kind of develop the requirements, they far exceed those minimums. So we took into account the smaller agencies that maybe don't have the resources we do to do the big scale stuff. But that was a push to say, hey, look, we've got these training standards. We're trying to become professional.
Now, the field training officer program is a fairly standard program that you find within on the patrol side. Do you guys utilize the field training concepts or on-the-job training concepts in your training in the dispatch centers?
Steve, I stole yours down in Bloomington.
I know, but I was just asking to hear you say it.
Okay, yes, Steve. No, I'm serious. We kind of had an idea, but back at that time, there wasn't like a standardized way of doing it. And when in talking to you, when you were putting together the FTO program down in Bloomington, was, you were more than willing to share your information with me to where I could look at it and say, oh, we can adapt this to dispatchers. And we did. And I think that, made a difference down there when you're training people. What we're using up here, while it was in place before I came up here, it resembles what you put together down there. It makes it easy to be consistent. I think it's fair. So, that was one of the great things I learned. And I still can, in my head, when I'm talking to somebody at another agency and they're talking about training, I bring up that FTO program that you designed, and to look at how that stuff is set up for them.
And that's one of the things I do try to talk about when I travel, is the fact that, it's not specific. That program is universal in how people learn and how adults learn, and how you can organize a program to provide a maximum exposure to all the things you need to do. And I think it works well in a tremendous amount of settings. There are a lot of CTO programs out there. So I think that it's a critical portion of the onboarding. If you don't have any good training process for your people coming in, I think you're going to see some real ineffective performance out of them as they get on later in their careers.
I agree wholeheartedly on that. I think one of the biggest things that the mentality, and not that it was a bad mentality up here by any means, but as far as trying to nurture people that are coming on board, the purpose of a CTO or an FTO is not to wash somebody out of the program. If you go in with the fact that, 2 days in, you're already determined somebody's not going to make it, that's not fair to that individual. We do know some people are going to wash out. My theory is, as far as an FTO or in the communication side of it, a CTO, it is to provide them every resource they need to succeed.
Jeff, as we come to wrap this up, what's the one thing that you would like the officers to know about the dispatchers? If you could just have one thing, what is it you want the officers to know about the dispatchers?
Probably about the fact that as much as we may go back and forth on the radio, the dispatchers do care. The dispatchers do care. And if there is a situation that happens and a particular dispatcher is working that radio when that situation occurs, it affects them more than what they realize.
And for those people out there that, maybe aren't in public safety or thinking about getting into it, what's one thing you'd like them to know about maybe seeking a job as a dispatcher?
I would, reach out to the center, and then, if you're interested, find out if they're hiring, and if they're not hiring at that given moment, ask them if you can sit in and observe. That'll give you the idea of whether you want to apply when they do have openings.
Jeff, during my career at BPD, I spent a lot of time on the streets, and I got to tell you, there were always two voices that when I got on the radio because something bad was happening, I wanted to hear back. One was Kim's, and the other was yours, and I want to thank you for that.
Well, thanks. That means a lot, and I'll tell you what, I can say this across the nation when I talk to people. That's one thing that we always hear from a lot of our responders when they're talking about their particular department, that there are certain dispatchers that they are glad when they hear their voices on the radio. So the officers do recognize the ones that are truly care, but there are those ones that they feel comfortable with. Because part of our responsibility is, regardless of what you're dealing with, is not to add any additional stress to you. So I take that as a compliment, Stephen. I thank you for it.
And that's the story we have to tell. Thank you for joining. As always, I'm curious what questions you're getting asked. What isn't the news covering? What story needs to be told? Connect with me at bluecanarypodcast@gmail.com.